Good morning, everybody. We are today is our last day of Fiscal 14, and we are going to start with Professor John Traxler's plenary talk. He's from the University of Wolverhampton and Professor of Mobile Learning, as you all probably know. He's going to be talking about language, literacy, and mobiles.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for actually surviving, living through it and turning up after the gala lunch dinner. I was going to launch more or less straight into my topic, but I could say maybe about three personal things just to give you some context. Certainly one of them is that I'm absolutely rubbish at languages. When asked how many languages am I fluent in, the answer is about 10, but they're all computer languages. I'm not even very good at those any longer. I currently work quite a lot in the, quotes, global south and with UNESCO, and it's partly a consequence of my concern for the relationship, what I see as maybe the pernicious relationship between mobile technology and indigenous culture and local languages. So that kind of explains part of where I'm coming from. And the other is that I did the slides a couple of days ago using one part of my head, and then wrote the text later using a different part of my head, so they don't necessarily match up, but my justification is that some of you are visual learners, so you can look at the slides, and everyone else can listen to what I'm saying, and then maybe you can try and reconcile the two halves later. If I had a mission or an abstract or a synopsis, it was basically three things, and this is helpful for me because it means I can do kind of 15 minutes, 15 minutes and 15 minutes, optimistically thinking I can manage my time. And the first was actually to talk about mobiles as a technology for learning, brackets, languages. The second was mobiles as a determinant of language, because I think mobiles are a major factor shaping the way language evolves these days. And the third was mobiles as a determinant of the social context of language, because I think language is clearly something that happens in a social environment and is part of a kind of wider realm of discourse and interaction. And actually, mobiles are shaping that wider world as well. Okay, so because of my unfamiliarity, really, I'm a complete fraud actually, my unfamiliarity with the world of language learning, some of this is going to kind of make sense, and maybe some of this is going to be obvious, and maybe some of this is going to be stimulating or provocative or just plain wrong. But in looking at mobiles as a delivery mechanism or a way of supporting language learning, I've kind of managed to, if you like, develop a classification so I can kind of give some larger context for what I think we've done or not, where we've succeeded or not. That helps me kind of think where might we be going and what are the lines of work to pursue. And clearly one of the things we've done with mobiles is actually to take learning to people or communities or regions for whom other conventional or traditional educational interventions have been, dangerous, impossible, expensive, or difficult. And I don't know, at first sight that doesn't seem to have much relationship to language learning, because what we're often talking about is something really quite simple, using maybe something like SMS or USSD or something of that sort, or interactive voice recognition, to reach out across large distances, where what we've been trying to do is reach deeply rural areas in African villages, for example, and to take learning into those kinds of environments. And maybe that's not where language learning happens. Although actually, if you look at the work of the Janala project in Bangladesh, which is talking about kind of 11 million users teaching English, maybe there is quite a lot of traction in thinking about this particular aspect of mobile learning, where it's reaching out. What the ambition is scale, sustainability, because we're exploiting the user's own devices, we're not supplying them, So I think that's one of our achievements, and I think there is work in language learning. And if I reflect on what I was doing kind of more than 12 years ago, the first EU mobile learning project was using interactive voice recognition with Arab immigrants into Italy, using interactive voice recognition to teach them Italian vocabulary. So it's not a kind of media-rich end of what we do. It actually works, and it's cheap, it's scalable, sustainable, and has a history of language learning. But if I extend, well, this is an example from Cambodia, where I was working with health education for adolescent Khmer young people. And again, same kind of argument, that it's a way of extending the reach of traditional educational interventions because of the kind of completely universal ownership of bottom-end type of phones using SMS. So I think there's a strong case for thinking about just really the kind of dumb end of the market in terms of technology. It works, it's scalable. And actually thinking, okay, so this is addressing the challenges of distance, if you like, in a kind of geometric or geographic sense. But I think we've also used it to address distance or separation in social and economic terms, where conventional educational interventions haven't worked because people can't afford them, or they are intimidated or stigmatised in schools or colleges or university, or they're marginal to the mainstream of the population in the country. And this is an example from South Africa called Mixit. Mixit is the platform, it's a kind of data platform, and it's very, very cheap. But there's about 49 or 50 social and educational activities going on that. And this particular one is called Dr. Math. So again, it's mobile phones, bottom end, 100% penetration. Kids love using Mixit for all sorts of different reasons, and you can put an educational intervention on top of that, Dr. Math in this case, which this won't be legible, it's the only piece of text I've got, but it just illustrates how Dr. Math works. Kids dial in with this messaging platform with their queries about maths, because South Africa has an awful problem with the maths matriculation, and they get put through on a text basis to an undergraduate who helps them with their maths queries. And yeah, it's widely popular, so it's easy to scale up. It's actually sustainable, which is unusual for most of the things we've done. It's sustainable because the undergraduates get credit for helping the kids. The Mixit platform gets a minimal amount of revenue because of the connection, but from hundreds of thousands of kids. And clearly the kids think it's a cheap way of getting assistance with their maths. But it illustrates the fact that you can use it for a variety of other areas of the curriculum. So someone else is now working on using it for kind of life and social skills. I guess there is a way of using it for language as well. Though curiously, because it's a highly kind of informal end of learning, the language that's going on here is a kind of township text speak. So it's quite an interest, so it's got a language of its own, or they've got a language of their own. And it's interesting in that respect, looking at the dialogue and the transactions. And this is rather different. This is, if you're standing in Oxford Street, in central London, with a dumb phone, you can get contextual information. Information that is specific to exactly where you are, in order that you can find out where the nearest public toilet is. And so, I think this is one of the few examples of contextual mobile learning that is at this really kind of dumb end of the market. Really simple dumb phones. The only flaw with this is actually the noticing question is on the public toilet. So actually, but the principle is certainly there, even if the practice is a bit kind of rudimentary. And clearly it would work most effectively in densely populated city areas, because that's where the base stations are fairly close together, and it can give a fairly accurate fix on where you are. I mean, doing this in a rural area would probably tell you the nearest public toilet is about 15 miles away. You know, so yeah, an introduction to contextual mobile learning, learning that is related to where you are, possibly where you've been as well, and a version that is kind of sustainable. It costs practically nothing, and there's no doubt a way of monetising this. So every time you ask where a toilet is, someone makes 5. I was going to say P. That's not good. I'll move swiftly on. And I guess what we've seen again in Africa mainly. That's another aspect of using mobiles to take learning into different and distant communities is e-books. And I'm using this slide for a variety of reasons. I mean, e-books are incredibly popular with various USAID activities because essentially you can parachute a crate full of them into a school or into an area in West Africa, East Africa, various other parts of the world, and that's kind of the job done. There's no maintenance problem. You know, as long as they can power the thing up, it's got 1,500 books, and it's got the entire school library in. But it illustrates a rather different point that worries me more and more, and that is that when I'm talking about taking learning into different and distant communities, it is of course taking our learning into those different and distant communities. And I found myself at a conference in Africa just about to say that, and I thought, oh God, it's a kind of Columbus discovered America kind of statement. Well, no, Columbus didn't. There were Americans already there. And this actually is Virginia Woolf, 20th century woman writer, upper middle class. So what this Kenyan girl will understand about, for example, a story called To the Lighthouse is difficult to imagine. I mean, the gender politics are okay, but otherwise it's a bit problematic. But nevertheless, the technology has enabled learning to take place that wouldn't have taken place otherwise, I guess. I mean, but as I say, I don't think it's that straightforward. And ironically, the World Reader people who are the charity behind this have promotional videos saying the kids now don't play football anymore because their reading is so interesting. And I'm not sure if I fully fall in with that as a promotional aspect of the scheme. And one of the other things, there is this Nairobi bus station. Another aspect of this, taking learning where it wasn't before, or taking our learning where it wasn't before, is actually the notion of using dead time. Like in the elevator or at the bus queue. And I gather that Japanese researchers seem to think that they're marketing waterproof phones because 1 in 10 people in Japan drops their phone down the toilet. So there are lots of learning opportunities that we could be exploiting that are not necessarily paper-based. I'll try and cut down on the lapses in taste. And this was the EM learning project I referred to earlier, which was Sweden, Italy and the UK. Targeted at needs, not in education, employment and training. People who were homeless, kids 19 to 24 I think was the age range. If you like, it's an extension of what I'm describing, the process of using mobiles to take learning to places where it wouldn't have been before. Not because they were geographically distant, because actually they were socially distant. That these were people with no conception of entering formal learning. They weren't a long way away geographically. They could have been sleeping in our doorways. But the underlying rationale was actually these kids are familiar with their phones, they feel confident on small keyboards, that's where we'll start. And it was funded by the EU on a perfectly kind of instrumental basis that if we get them used to using small keyboards and informal learning, then we can get them into college on big keyboards, and then we can get them into jobs, and then they'll start paying taxes. And at the time, it was the biggest, I think 200 learners across these 3 countries. It was the biggest project there had been. And when we did the evaluation, it was interesting because, in looking at the rationale, this will get them into college, which is much cheaper. The unit costs of putting someone through college are a lot cheaper than doing this. Half the kids said, yeah, this is fabulous, I like mobile learning, I want to go on to proper learning. And the other half said, I like mobile learning, why should I bother to go on to proper learning? I quite like doing it this way, can I just carry on doing it this way? But again, as a remark about mobiles overcoming separation or distance, this is a social or an economic distance. But again, I suppose I also have concerns that what the education system does is kind of co-opt people into a particular way of thinking about things, the way the education system thinks they ought to be thinking about things. And actually, I suppose the education system as a whole is about learning a language. It's about learning the language of the learned. You know, you go in unable to speak like a physicist, you come out able to speak like a physicist. You know, and I suppose there's lots of discussion back in the 60s or the 70s about the hidden curriculum, you know, about the purpose of education is to, I don't know, look after your kids whilst you go and work in a factory, or to train people to service the economy. Well, there's also a different aspect of that, which is to do with maybe inculcating social conformity, and mobiles just make that easier to do, for all I know. And this might be an example as well. We discovered that lots of circus folk, Roma, travellers, for example in the UK, miss out on their schooling because, well, firstly because they're moving around, and secondly because they're stigmatised. To some extent, well, clearly mobiles overcome the moving around part of it, but they also allow us to connect to a group of the population that are stigmatised. You know, so Roma kids can get an education in spite of what their normal, mainstream peer group think about them and interact with them. So again, it's reaching out, it's kind of crossing a distance. And this is again, if you like, a problematic example. People who are separated from the education system because of physical or cognitive difference. So people who are blind or people who are hearing impaired. And okay, maybe they had a dedicated technology before that was specifically for people with that difficulty or this difficulty. But now actually they can use mobile phones just like the rest of us. You know, there's an app for it. There is probably an app for it, there are probably lots of apps for it. Sorry, the battery's going to go flat in 10 minutes.
Postponer.
Shall I just
postpone it for longer than 10 minutes.
So again, I'm very conscious it's a technology that kind of will bring people into the mainstream of education, but my university has a very strong and proud reputation of working with people who are deaf, and actually they don't necessarily want to be deprived of what makes them a cultural community. You know, they have British Sign Language, another reference to language. I'm making the language connections here. You know, but it's part of their cultural identity, and do they want to be made normal? I mean, Stephen Fry says he doesn't want to be deprived of being bipolar. It's kind of, you know, and maybe Beethoven wouldn't have composed so well if he hadn't gone deaf. You know, it's that kind of. Moving back to kind of slightly safer ground, we've also used these technologies to help people in the complex institutions of education. And we're now seeing increasingly kind of downloadable apps, web interface, location-specific, that tell people how to find their way about the university. So this is an example from a project called Mobile Oxford, which is free for download, and you can kind of customise it to any university, but it mashes up public information about kind of bus timetables or roadworks with institutional information about the library or student enrolments or your learner management system, in order to answer all sorts of questions like, where is the nearest copy of the book I want that's available for loan? You know, so if you've got many libraries with many books, some of which are on loan and some of which are reserved copies, where's the nearest one I can actually take out? So, you know, those kinds of questions are actually quite intimidating and difficult, and are nothing to do with learning the course you're on. They're to do with the kind of complexity of our institutions. So again, it's reduced the distance between maybe non-traditional, unconfident learners and actually doing some learning. And we've seen work now in making assessment, if you like, more authentic. because you can. So the UK had a large program called MolNet, which was about 14, 15 million pounds across 3 years in would you call it TVET, technical and vocational education. So, for example, physiotherapy. How do you do assessment of a physiotherapy student? Well, you can do it actually in situ with a smartphone, camera phone, taking video clips, all the rest of it. And I guess that's part of a movement to take learning away from the classroom or the institution itself. And then the second thing I think we've done is actually, and again you can look for, if you like, kind of language similarities here, but it's a whole raft of things that have made learning somehow richer. But again, I'd say it's kind of our learning, because this has happened within the institutions, within the curriculum, within the professionals. So what I'd call contingent learning. So for example, field trips where the learning is not on the basis of a script, but actually on the basis of reality, that you're able to measure information there and then, and think about it and react. So there's quite a lot of work about kids learning to think like scientists because they can take measurements and formulate a hypothesis. So it's not reenacting what Michael Faraday did 200 years ago. It's actually thinking like Michael Faraday. What do I need to know? What could I hypothesize? How can I test that hypothesis? So contingent, in the here and now. And this is students in lectures using mobile devices to feed back with their lecturer, so that the lecturer can respond, again, in real time to what's going on, to what makes this class different from the other class, so that they can maybe, go faster, go slower, explain something. So these are the personal response systems, but again, it's contingent. And then there's a lot of work in students who are training with nurses, doctors, vets, teachers, supporting them on their placements or internships. And back to a more high-end version of contextual learning, where this person is learning about this painting because they're standing in front of it, and their mobile phone knows where they're standing, and it knows how long they've been standing and where they came from and what they did previously, and so it can begin to feed information. And there's lots of different versions of this. So here's an outdoor one. These students are looking at this because it enriches their understanding of the context they're in. They're doing town planning or... there is always the kind of downside is they're supposed to be looking at the environment, not looking at their mobile phone. They're supposed to be looking at the painting, not at their mobile phone. And you could argue that at a certain point they become overwhelmed by the contextual information. This becomes more interesting than that. And I don't know if that's a design issue or just an inherent problem. And here we have augmented reality. And this particular one uses QR codes. You're using the phone as a camera viewfinder, and what's really there is whatever it is, the car park. So there it is. What isn't really there is the car. And it's completely authentic in the sense that you can walk up to it, walk away from it, walk around it, and what you're seeing continues to be convincing. So there's another example, the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall isn't there. The Brandenburg Gate is. So again, you can walk up to it, you can walk away from it, and you can. The educational possibilities are almost limitless. Language and pretty much anything else. And this is a kind of social version, which I think is Dan Square in Amsterdam. Sorry? Correct. I can only bluff so much. Where people can share this experience. And there's work, I think, with kind of detective stories, where you can go to a particular place and it will play a particular clip of a person being interviewed, and you can it's a whodunit. So I think all of those are fairly obvious. The possibilities are fairly obvious. As I've said, I think it's quite conservative. It's about how do we make the existing curriculum maybe a bit sexier. And this is the last part of that, which is the idea of performance support. And so what we've seen is education moving away from the idea of learning just in case. We'll teach you something when you're 18 and you might get to use it when you're 48. So the idea of learning just in time. Okay, so now we can kind of, what is it you need to learn? We can teach it to you now. So the idea that you actually don't need to learn it anyway, because the computer will do it for you. Which I think poses an interesting problem for example, for language learning. I mean, this is used a lot increasingly in maybe first response, ambulances, where, or stuff like repairing cars and photocopiers, where you need expertise, you need guidance. This can capture the contextual information. Maybe it can take a picture. Maybe it knows about your location, which enable you to do your job better. So maybe it will make a diagnosis on the way to the hospital. And at a certain point, we stop saying it can help you do your job better, and we start saying it can do your job for you. So although it's kind of economically attractive and presumably makes capitalism work better, there's also kind of issues about autonomy, agency, or de-skilling. It's doing things for you instead of you. And I was struck by the possibility of what's this saying about language? And I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. Is for the Anglophiles, Anglophones. It's Douglas Adams' Babel fish. You put it in your ear and it translates everything for you. And I guess we're getting to the point where real-time contextual information and all sorts of other possibilities for performance support can tell you what can do your language for you. You put this in your ear and it translates any language into English in the science fiction Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I think that's a possibility. I'm not sure, but in a kind of piecemeal and technological sort of way, and it's quite interesting and quite challenging. Okay, so what other kind of general categories of mobile learning are there? I've done one which I think is to do with extending and reaching out, and one to do with enriching, and I think there is a vast amount of learning that's now being done informally from learners themselves. So I think I listen to thousands of podcasts, but they're all actually created by enthusiasts. For example, one on Ottoman history. I think I have 1,800 podcasts in my computer. None of them prepared by a corporation or a publisher. They are all enthusiasts or crackpots. And it's an example of people using mobile to generate their own learning. And I'll come back to this afternoon, but we've also seen the rise of MOOCs, another way of people generating their own learning, a kind of slightly different ideology, possibly, but we're talking about communities cooperating, synthesizing, the synergy of people working together to help each other learn. And that's kind of as likely as not, so outside the institution as well as inside the institution. They may be completely separate from the institution, from university schools and colleges. And then we have a completely different community of people learning together, learning about the world of Warcraft. And there are lots of those communities focused on a particular topic, generating their own learning, actually deciding what's worth learning, what's not worth learning, who you learn it from, what you learn about, how you establish that you've learned it. It's a completely, if you like, parallel universe to what we think of as learning in an official context. And maybe formal educators think this is very good, they're thinking a lot, they're discussing a lot, and maybe attempt to kind of co-opt it by saying, well, we can use the World of Warcraft to develop people's metacognitive skills. But I think that's kind of missing the point. For me, the point is that there are worlds, communities, spaces out there inhabited by people learning from each other, deciding their own agenda, as I say, deciding what is worth learning, able to create or transform or share or discuss images, ideas, information, opinions, all of which looks like learning in the broadest possible sense, but is not something that the formal educational institutions have managed to capture. And I don't know if that's true of language learning any more or any less than the formal institutions of learning. And this is rather different. This isn't mobile. This is Sugatramitra's hole-in-the-wall experiment. And you don't have to be very imaginative to think that the hole-in-the-wall housing the internet browser could just as easily be a mobile phone with an internet browser. And he argues that this catalyses self-organising communities. That may be true, but it may be self-organising communities who've decided to watch pornography or go to websites that tell them the earth is flat. So I think all of a sudden, mobiles as the portal to a wider world of user-generated content are a very different kind of cognitive world to the ones that we control, where we're just enriching or extending what we've done as professional educators. And this is a rather different version of that, and this is, if you like, citizen journalism. This is the London bombings of 2007, I think. Where citizen journalism is people with camera phones taking pictures of, for example, a bombing, and then using Flickr, YouTube to post it and give it a worldwide audience. This reinforces the earlier remarks. There are two things going on here. We're presented with this as a kind of democratisation of news, and if you like, therefore, the democratisation of history. But clearly, and it's no longer in the control of the BBC or the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Information. It's people. It's kind of people power. But clearly, it's not. I mean, Google and YouTube are just large American corporations. And secondly, whilst we're talking about people able to generate their own knowledge, to generate stuff that people can learn from, it's not kind of objective. I'm not saying any other learning is objective either. But I think we're a lot more used to the idea of kind of interrogating the authenticity of other stuff. And this is presented as raw and unmediated. Well, no, it's not. I mean, this could have been taken by telling a story about plucky Londoners. It could have been, this is the infidels getting what was coming to them. And so if I show this in Ramallah or wherever, it resonates very, very differently from the story that you're probably seeing in it. And you could argue that, we're moving into a new kind of epistemological world where people learn things and understand things in very, very different ways, because suddenly they become much more kind of, partial or transient or fragmentary than they used to be when there was kind of a library and it had all you needed to know in it, and it was there. It's been like that for 200 years. And so that's kind of user-generated learning. And then if we've achieved anything else, actually, the no-brainer is that everyone seems to love it. People are enthusiastic. And again, I imagine that's just as true for language learning. It engages people who aren't engaged. It reaches out to disenfranchised groups. Is there a downside to all of this? Quite a few, I think. I think we haven't been very good at scaling up or finding business models or sustaining or embedding or institutionalising a lot of what we've done. And a lot of it has been very fixed-term, short-term projects run by enthusiasts that have probably, in the course of the last 15 years, really only proved that if you spend money on education, it gets better. It just happens to be that this is what the money got spent on. Because we haven't been particularly good at evaluation, and we never addressed the question, was this a better idea than more school libraries? We just addressed the idea about, was this a good way of doing mobile learning or not? But we have actually made, I guess, some kind of contribution to how we theorise or conceptualise learning. And we started out thinking it kind of like this. It's basically e-learning that is somehow moves around, but otherwise no different. And I kind of sometimes make this point in front of non-academic audiences, slightly embarrassed. I'm talking about theory. God, how boring. And then realise that if we don't have one, everyone else will anyway. So I will continue to say this, that I think, theories about how people learn, or how people learn language, for example, are important, because if we don't have them and if we don't say them, then someone's going to say something really dumb, like content is king. They already are saying that, actually. So I think there is still a place for research, but as I go to UNESCO meetings, for example, I have seen the theory and the thinking drop out of what we do, and it's kind of on the basis that if you're a parent, you know everything about education because you've got children and they go to school, and if you've got a mobile phone, you understand mobile learning because it's simple, isn't it? It's obvious, it's common sense. So I think we need to keep fighting for any kind of foothold, because if we don't, then someone else will, and it's worrying. But I still don't think we've necessarily kind of conceptualised what it is we're trying to work with. So it's not a computer that you can carry around, nor actually is it a phone. I don't even think we've actually got a very accurate word for it. The Germans have got handy, which is fairly obvious and fairly accurate. But the English call it a mobile, but that was because at one point there was a mobile and there was a not mobile. But now no one's got a not mobile. No one has a landline, no one has a static phone, really, apart from something that is connected to their office or their home, but not to them. So it's not really a mobile phone because it's the only one of it. There's not a static one, really. But it's not really a phone either because of the number of things it does. I still think we're struggling to conceptualise what it is, and maybe we shouldn't even try. And as I say, I think we've had trouble. So how am I doing for timing?
5 minutes. 10 minutes.
Okay. We've had trouble scaling up what we've done a lot of the time because it's been subsidised, fixed term, small scale, and it doesn't really tell us doing things small scale doesn't tell us very much about how to do them big, and doing them fixed term doesn't really tell us very much about how to do them on a sustainable basis, and doing them with enthusiasts, especially doing them with enthusiasts in the optional part of the curriculum, doesn't tell us very much about doing them with the rank and file and the compulsory part of the curriculum. So I think we've probably wasted most of the last 12 years. And I suppose another kind of problematic issue is if we're asking about what's the role of mobile learning in relation to language learning or anything else, is to what extent do they represent just a new way of industrialising how we run our universities? Many universities in the UK have been forced to put larger and larger numbers of students through them, and the only way they've achieved that is by, if you like, industrialisation. How do you increase throughput? You introduce machinery, and the machinery in question used to be computer-assisted learning, and now it's mobile-assisted learning. So is this just a kind of post-Fordist version of what was earlier a Fordist version? I don't know. And certainly people often show this kind of slide saying, how we have the kids at their desks, how we still have the kids at their desks, how we have the kids at their desks. To what extent are we fundamentally challenging what's happening? And as I say, we've made mistakes about learning is content and went down that road and got nowhere. We've also had lots and lots of kind of behaviouristic games, that you drill and practice on. We've tried assuming it was actually a small computer, and we've tried putting Blackboard or WebCT on it, which usually only proves that it's a far less satisfactory and inappropriate experience compared to just sitting at a computer. We've made the mistake of assuming that because maybe parts of the education system are highly individualistic and run on the basis of everyone competing with everyone else, that actually that's how people learn in our culture or in others, and that's not necessarily the case. So a lot of the time, again, for example, in Africa, 5 people with 5 phones doesn't mean each one's got a phone, it just means they're all being passed around frantically. So I think we need to reconsider how we design learning with mobiles, because what we've done on the back of our history of computer-aided learning is design the artifacts of learning and not design the activities of learning. We've designed packages, or we've designed CAL programs, and what we now see is, especially mobiles, are kind of the portal onto a whole lot of educational or not so educational experience, and designing one app amongst millions, probably amongst millions which already do what your app does anyway, when the world is awash with user-generated content, our ongoing focus with designing an app seems a bit misplaced. And I can understand how we move from the idea of creating content to curating it, but we have to do that in a world where this might be how people are using their mobile phones, not I'm going to have a session with my app for 45 minutes. I don't think we know very much about people's behaviour with their phones, and certainly mobile phones are a social phenomenon, not an educational phenomenon. Most people do not spend much time on their phones on education. We might do, and we might have a kind of professional history of doing it, or of moving from computers to phones, and that's how we view the phone, as an education opportunity, but the rest of the world doesn't. And I think we need to kind of reconceive how we design, to bear in mind that their expectations and their habits and their activities are not formed by our kind of educational preconceptions, but by what they tell each other and what they learn from each other, and all of the various kind of ways in which the mobile forms part of their lives, rather than just an educational opportunity or activity. And finally, someone mentioned ethics a couple of days ago, and I think we're still struggling with that, and that's as much true of language learning aids as any other kind, that we can't actually anticipate the unexpected consequences of what we're doing with such a complex technology. This is a school in a southern English city, where they decided that everyone would have a little, I think it was pollution sensor attached to their phone, so you could have a school project, find out what's the pollution in the kind of catchment area around your school by walking backwards and forwards from your home to school and back to home with the sensor picking up the pollution. And this was so innovative that, of course, they put it on their website and were showing their kids as scientists, and they were also showing where every kid lived and what their route home was. And that is just one example where actually it's a complex, fluid, abstract technology, and actually thinking about, and it's a social one, not an educational one. You don't collect them all in after the lesson. So the ethical implications, I think, are problematic, and we haven't. Yeah, am I more or less?
Yeah.
What's the time now?
Quarter past.
Oh, right, okay. I haven't really got into quite a lot of what I was planning to say, so I'll just kind of attempt to summarise it. One of the things that interests and concerns me is the way that the technology shapes our use of language, and I can think of a whole lot of examples at very, very different levels. I mean, one is kind of text entry, when you're messaging, and how, for example, if you look at China, where people have historically two options over the last 70 years maybe, of using Chinese characters or using a Romanised version called pinyin. Well, if you've only got a keyboard, you're forced to use the Romanised version. Now with higher powered machines, you can actually draw characters, and there's a kind of predictive text version of using characters, etc., etc. And when I go to Arab-speaking regions or talk to colleagues in Kazakhstan, what I see is the mobile influencing the dynamic or the equilibrium between the various language options. I guess there's also, this was a reference to the fact that so many of our technology systems are built around a particular, maybe Western Californian set of expectations about icons, interactivity. I mean, I work with the San, who are the Bushmen of the Kalahari, for whom gesture is an integral part of their language. They don't have a word for yesterday or tomorrow. They point to the west or they point to the east. But all of these haptic gestural interfaces are not designed for them. They're designed presumably by Steve Jobs. You know, this is how I can gesture effectively with my computer, but it's not necessarily going to work with anyone else's computer. I mean, I think the same is possibly going on in a very kind of trivial level with autocorrect and those kinds of things where you're getting... There are words I won't use on my mobile phone because I know it's going to correct them into something stupid or inappropriate. And the list gets longer. I tried typing in cybersex yesterday and it turned it into ubersex. And I tried texting someone with a message about teaching old dog new tricks and it said teaching old dog new trucks. You know, it may be haphazard, but at various levels, the machines are shaping the way we use our language. And I guess there's also a very big literature about how they're shaping our social environment. So just two trivial examples. This is from someone who's English, maybe no one else will understand, but the English are very conscious of their private space, and in commuter trains they will all read newspapers and they will keep themselves to themselves in their personal space. And so when someone else's mobile phone goes, and maybe they have a domestic argument, everyone in the vicinity is very conscious of the need to say, I'm not eavesdropping, I'm not listening to your conversation. So maybe they shape their newspaper emphatically to signal, I am engrossed in my newspaper, I'm not listening to you getting a, sorry, nothing personal, getting a divorce, you know. And there's an example from Goffman about tie signs, which are the kind of the non-verbal cues which say, I'm having a conversation with you, and I'm making eye contact, even though I've got Asperger's syndrome. I'm making eye contact because this is an important transaction, but now I've got to learn how to do that with a mobile phone, and I've got to give you the message that I'm interested in having this conversation, even though I'm servicing a mobile phone, incoming phone call as well. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples where our kind of social practices, including the ones that take place when we are learning, are changing, and they're changing under the impact of mobile phones. There's some work on restaurants and about whether or not you put your mobile phone on the table in a restaurant, and how gender and hierarchy and formality are all determinants of that. So if I'm important, I'll put my phone on the table, and that says, you know, I'm important, and you can't because you're not. But it depends. If there's a waiter service, you're less likely to. If it's a cafe, you probably will do. So those are kind of consensual ways of what's appropriate. But clearly you need to understand those in order to be operating effectively. So I mean, if only in the context of kind of business English, there's now a whole set of cues and signals that we have to get our heads around that are fragmenting. You know, young people will do it differently from old people, and I guess the French will do it differently from the English. And so all of these things that are kind of the environment that language takes place in are now much more complex and are changing rapidly. But sorry, given the time, I'll stop now, and if anyone wants to hear more about that, please ask me at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
With my timing?
Yeah, we've got, thank you very much. We've got 10 minutes for questions. Anybody? There's got to be questions here. Please? No? Yeah.
For learning, you have applications that already exist, which we can use for learning and teaching purposes. But on the other hand, we need applications which have been developed specifically for language, for learning and teaching purposes. Well, in that respect, learning from the past, we know we need advanced linguistic didactic functionalities in those applications, and I personally have a problem with choosing the right development environment for those applications. You did not mention the problem of the several operating systems on those devices, so there are other people here developing applications or having applications developed. What is your view on the possibilities of HTML5 for developing applications? You mentioned programming languages, so I thought maybe you might have some views on that, because I don't see a lot happening in that field. I don't hear much about HTML5, which appears to be very promising for offering this kind of functionality and interactivity we need for language learning and teaching purposes.
I'm clearly not aware of the specifics, certainly the specifics in relation to language learning. So my intuitions, as I say, I think that it sounds like some of us are still committed to solving the wrong problem. And of treating learning with technology as an educational issue, and one which we have the responsibility and the opportunity to solve, kind of at the exclusion of everything else further away or in the outside world. And I think that's a justifiable assumption if you make people sit down and use computers, because kind of computers happen in their own space. You have a dedicated session. Windows takes so long to start. You're not going to use it opportunistically or informally. If you're starting up a CAL package, for example, or an app on a computer, that's rather different from how you might be using a phone. I guess phones are characterised by being a lot more, if you like, multimodal. There's a lot more goes on, and there's a lot more goes on in a very kind of thinly time-sliced way. People do lots of different things, jumping backwards and forwards. And most of those things are not educational. And if they did have an educational ambition, there is so much out there in terms of communities and resources and content and even applications. I'm not sure what exactly is the justification for designing more apps. In HTML5 or anything else. That's my problem. If I thought there was some kind of specific justification for designing an app, I'd then ask the question about HTML5. But I'm just very concerned that we're kind of locked into a view of ourselves as taking responsibility for what people do educationally, kind of at the expense of a wider world that they could be learning from, and our role in kind of helping them do that rather than kind of developing an artifact.
I understand that, but one simple example would be, well, I'm waiting for my train and I need some specific vocabulary in Italian, so I want to prepare myself, so I'm looking up some vocabulary and I try to learn it. So I would need a very simple app that would teach me that simple vocabulary. The problem is in which system can we develop it so that it works on an Apple thing or a Samsung thing in whatever operating system.
I also worry, I suppose, that things move so fast that there is always a risk that we're trying to solve yesterday's problem as well. I'm being very kind of broad, and so maybe the answer about learning Italian vocabulary would be exactly the one that needs solving, in a particular context with a particular app. But in more general terms, I worry about how we're positioning ourselves as educators in this new world.
We probably need several weeks to discuss that.
Yeah, sorry, my ideas are only half-baked, and another lifetime and I'll kind of finish baking them, but I'm struggling to kind of conceptualise what it is that needs doing in terms of our role as the designers of people's educational experiences, and worried that we're kind of fixated on designing people's educational objects, an artifact, a resource, an asset. And that's okay where it can monopolise the screen and the time and the activity, but all of a sudden with a mobile, it's not, it's a real mess. But anyway, yeah, and some years later we'll finish this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I don't have a question, I don't have a concern, because it seems that the key thing is technology and resources and all the technological development, mobile technology. But I think it is not just a question of placing the learners in front of the computers, in front of the tablets, in front of... I think a key factor is still the teacher, even though we are trying to applied methodology, which is learning center. But I think we still need to somehow invest on teacher training and teachers prepared for all this technology so that learning is quality, is efficient. It's, I think that's the education we need in the future. It's not only gadgets, but using the gadgets with I don't know, at least certain intelligence. Learning from the past. So I don't know what you think of this.
I think there's a connection between what you're asking and the previous remarks, because I'm still struggling to figure out where design stops and teaching starts. Because clearly if I'm describing a new model of design that is to do with designing an educational activity rather than designing an educational object, then that begins to look like teaching. And so what are the responsibilities of the teacher when, as I said, there's a world of content, communities, apps, websites, what is the teacher to do in that world? What's the nature of their responsibility? And maybe part of the nature of their responsibility is not to produce content, and actually maybe not to even to find content, because there's more than they can ever find. Maybe it's to give their learners the kind of critical skills so they know good content from bad content, or so they know how to create content as well as consume content, or so they know how to take part in a community of other learners and not necessarily the one that's in the classroom in front of them. But I think also the role of the teacher changes because, as I've said, the kind of, even the institutional context changes if suddenly kids sitting there have mobile phones and they can access Wikipedia. All of a sudden I'm not an expert because you can look it up as well. So I think that kind of reconceptualises what it is that teachers need to be trained to do. And I guess that is also partly to do with the new social environment that they are trying to manage. A friend of mine is a school governor, and he asked the head teacher, "How's your policy on mobile phones going?" And the head teacher said, "It's a success, it's a real success. We've confiscated 687 phones." You can't make it go away, and we hear about kids saying they go to school and they power down. They've got 7 devices in their bedroom, and if they're lucky they can have their mobile phone if it's turned on silent. There are some technologies to deal with that, where we can say, not at a social level but at a technical level, you can have your mobile phone in the school if we, the school, can put an app on it which will maybe blacklist or whitelist the URLs, or will allow you incoming calls, or allow only data to come in, and if you break that rule, the app will turn your phone off. So we can do it at a technical level, but maybe we can do it at a social level and say, look, we're all here to learn, and we can't have our phones ringing all the time, so let's all agree you can have your phone here but you can't use it. Actually, someone else did some survey work in South African schools. They asked South African kids what they thought about mobile phones in schools, and one of them said, "It's a real nuisance when the teacher gets an incoming call. It's a real distraction. They shouldn't be allowed to have phones." So is that an answer? It's kind of parts of an answer.
I think I totally agree, but I would like to highlight the need of establishing a dialogue between technology and education.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Somehow it's what you've been mentioning, but we sometimes start developing lots of apps, and we barely hear what teachers need. And so, more than a two-to dialogue, we also have to include what learners need, what they think.
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated world, and certainly the argument for mobiles is not that they are good for learning, but it's actually just that the rest of the planet is full of them. And they're changing what we do. bad, good, indifferent, but they're out, so if the school system is to look like the rest of society, rather than looking like kind of 1990s, then somehow there have got to be changes. And it's not to do with education, it's to do with credibility.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Okay, you've got a couple of parallel sessions now and coffee break. Thank you.